Everybody remembers Gaugamela for the same image. Alexander screaming forward at the head of his companion cavalry, the Persian center splitting apart, and King Darius turning his chariot to run. But that image is the end of the story, not the real key to it. Because Gaugamela was not won by one heroic charge alone. It was won by pressure, deception, nerve, and one savage idea. Force the biggest army on earth to fight the wrong battle on the wrong ground at the wrong moment. Darius came to Gaugamela with everything a world emperor could want: a colossal army, endless cavalry, scythed chariots, war elephants, a plain personally prepared for slaughter. He did not come hoping to survive. He came expecting to crush Alexander so completely that the Macedonian invasion would end in one day. And yet, before the killing even began, the trap was already being twisted against him. Alexander did not rush forward like a fool. He studied the field. He read the enemy. He let fear work through the Persian camp all night. Then, when the sun rose over the blood-flat plain of Gaugamela, he did something that must have looked insane. He moved sideways. That single movement bent the entire battle out of shape. And once the Persian line began to stretch, crack, and lose its form, the fate of an empire was no longer a question of numbers. It became a question of who could keep control for just a few more minutes. So, if you want to understand Gaugamela, do not start with the final charge. Start with the field. Start with the trap. Start with the king who believed he had prepared the perfect battlefield, and the predator who came there to destroy the battlefield itself. By the spring of 331 BC, Alexander's campaign had already transformed the war. After pausing briefly in Egypt, the Macedonian army resumed its advance with frightening momentum. Syria had been secured. Phoenicia had been broken. Egypt, one of the richest and most symbolic Persian possessions in the West, was now under Alexander's control. This was no longer a coastal raid or a frontier war. The western shield of the Persian Empire had been systematically ripped away. What came next was the most dangerous phase of all: the invasion of the imperial interior. Alexander was no longer fighting for position on the edges of Persian power. He was moving toward the very zone where the empire would have to either stop him or begin to come apart from the center outward. On the other side stood Darius III, fully aware that this confrontation would be different from all the others. He had drawn on the enormous resources of the empire to assemble another massive army for one final reckoning. That is what makes Gaugamela so important. It was not just another big battle. It was the collision point between two completely opposite systems of war. Alexander's method was speed, disruption, and ruthless initiative. He moved before the empire could recover, struck before it could stabilize, and kept forcing Persia to react instead of dictate. Darius' method was scale, depth, and controlled destruction. He wanted to use the empire's size, cavalry, prepared ground, and massive numbers to create a field where the invader would be swallowed whole. This was not simply Macedon versus Persia. It was maneuver versus mastitude, flexibility versus enormity, a compact blade against a giant body. And both men knew what was at stake. If Alexander won, the road into the Persian heartland would split open. If Darius won, the invasion would be broken where it mattered most, and Alexander's entire eastern gamble could collapse. By the time the armies moved toward Gaugamela, they were no longer just heading toward battle. They were heading toward judgment. Alexander's advance, the most obvious road for Alexander, was the eastern bank of the Euphrates, heading toward Babylon. That route made sense geographically, logistically, and politically. It was the path any conventional invader would likely take. And that was exactly why Darius wanted him to take it. The Persian king had planned for predictability. He expected Alexander to move through brutal southern heat under increasing supply pressure. In that environment, Darius could combine attrition, scorched earth methods, and then a massive field battle once the Macedonians had already been weakened. But Alexander shattered that logic. After crossing the Euphrates, he abruptly turned northeast across the Mesopotamian plain toward the Tigris. This was not just a route change. It was a strategic disruption. It pulled the campaign away from the exact corridor Darius had hoped to exploit and shifted operations into a cooler northern zone, where environmental pressure would be less punishing. In one move, Alexander denied Persia the battle rhythm it wanted. River crossing and reconnaissance between July and August of 331 BC, Alexander's army reached Thapsacus Shoal. There, Hephaestion's vanguard had already built 2 pontoon bridges over the Euphrates. On the far bank stood Mazias with about 3,000 cavalry, but he did not contest the crossing. His force acted more as observers than blockers. Darius was not trying to stop Alexander there. He was studying him and waiting for the right place to kill him. By mid-September, Alexander reached the Tigris. Again, the Macedonians crossed without facing the kind of catastrophic river attack that might have destroyed them midstream. That absence is revealing. Darius was intentionally refusing one opportunity because he believed he was constructing a far better one. As Persian scouting elements were driven off and prisoners taken, the Macedonians uncovered the truth. Darius was waiting near Gaugamela with a colossal army, and he had been reshaping the battlefield itself. The ground had been cleared and leveled. Obstacles had been removed. Laborers had been sent out to manufacture ideal conditions for Persian weapons and Persian maneuver. Alexander immediately understood what this meant. Darius was not simply choosing a battlefield, he was engineering one. Darius' preparation near Gaugamela. Darius transformed terrain into strategy. He ordered the plains smoothed, rocks removed, uneven surfaces flattened, and the earth prepared for speed. This was done above all for the scythed chariots, one of the most terrifying weapons in the Persian arsenal. These chariots were only effective if they had clean space to accelerate, strike, and tear through dense formations. Darius wanted the battlefield to function like a giant killing runway, where the Macedonians would be broken by chariots, stretched by cavalry, and finished by sheer scale. This was imperial warfare at its most deliberate. Persia would not rely on courage alone, or luck, or a sudden strike. It would use preparation, breadth, and terrain itself as force multipliers. But that preparation revealed something else about Darius. He believed the battle would be decided by the field he made. Alexander, by contrast, was already thinking about how to make that field irrelevant. Once the Macedonian king grasped the Persian plan, he did not rush forward in panic or pride. He halted his army and allowed it one more meaningful period of rest before battle. That decision mattered. While Darius prepared the ground for destruction, Alexander prepared his men to survive the destruction long enough to break the system behind it. Psychological warfare the night before Gaugamela was not silent. It was poisonous. Knowing that Alexander's army included Greek mercenaries and allied troops, the Persians launched a campaign of psychological corruption. Secret letters offering wealth and reward were smuggled into the Macedonian camp, urging soldiers to betray Alexander and murder him. The goal was simple. If the enemy could not be broken yet by cavalry and chariots, perhaps it could be weakened by fear and greed from inside. When one letter was intercepted, Armenian advised that it be suppressed. His reasoning was harsh and practical. Greed recognizes no crime, not even the murder of a king. The camp was tightened, discipline reinforced, and the threat contained. But the deeper lesson remained. Even before swords crossed, Darius was trying to unmake Alexander's army psychologically. Terrain reconnaissance that night, Alexander personally rode with cavalry to survey the Persian position from higher ground. Below him stretched an immense host, larger than anything he had faced before, a vast sea of cavalry and imperial manpower. This reconnaissance was not ceremonial. It was essential. Alexander needed to see with his own eyes the width of the Persian front, the structure of the deployment, the relationship between the leveled ground and the enemy's intentions. He was not only looking at soldiers, he was reading design. The War Council at the War Council, Parmenion proposed a night attack. It was a rational suggestion. Persian numbers were enormous, and surprise and darkness might create confusion before the enemy could exploit its advantages. Alexander refused. His famous line was that he would not steal victory like a thief. But behind the theatrical phrasing was hard military judgment. A night attack on that scale could just as easily dissolve Macedonian control as Persian control. Alexander's greatest advantage lay in discipline, cohesion, and command under daylight conditions. To gamble that away in darkness would be to abandon the battlefield where he was strongest. Alexander's mental posture, the refusal, had one more devastating effect. It turned the entire night into a weapon against Darius. Because the Persians had no fully secure fortified camp and feared a surprise assault, Darius kept his vast army deployed and ready through the night. The soldiers stood armed, tense, exhausted, waiting for the blow that never came. Fear, uncertainty, and sleeplessness drained them before dawn. The Macedonians, by contrast, rested. Alexander completed his planning and then slept so deeply that Parmenion had to wake him in the morning. When asked how he could sleep with the largest army in the world waiting nearby, Alexander reportedly answered that Darius had done exactly what he wanted. That contrast tells us everything. Persia entered the dawn massive but strained. Macedon entered it smaller but centered. Darius had prepared the battlefield. Alexander had prepared the human beings who would have to distort it. The Persian army at Gaugamela was overwhelming in scale. Alexander fielded roughly 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry gun. Darius brought perhaps 100,000 to 150,000 troops, including up to 40,000 elite Eastern cavalry done. Whatever exact number one prefers, the basic truth is unchanged. The Persian battle line was so wide, it extended far beyond the Macedonian wings and could potentially envelop them from both sides. On the Persian left stood Bessus, commanding Bactrian cavalry and Scythian horse archers, mobile, aggressive forces, ideal for stretching and crushing an enemy flank in open space. On the right stood Mazias, leading Syrian and Armenian cavalry, equally dangerous and tasked with turning Persian breadth into tactical suffocation. At the center stood Darius himself, surrounded by his royal guard, Greek mercenaries, elite infantry, and a small number of war elephants. In front of the center were the 200 scythed chariots, poised as the terrifying opening instrument of Persian destruction. The whole Persian formation was meant to function as an engulfing system: disrupt, envelop, overwhelm. The Macedonian army, Alexander's formation, was built around a brutal truth. If he marched straight ahead into the center of the prepared plain, he might be crushed by encirclement. So his deployment was not conventional. It was defensive, elastic, and carefully structured for survival under pressure. At the center stood the phalanx, the dense wall of sarissas that formed the spine of the army. On the left, Parmenion commanded the Thessalian cavalry and supporting units, tasked with holding under what Alexander knew would be immense pressure. On the right stood Alexander himself with the Companion Cavalry, the blade reserved for the decisive moment. The most ingenious part of the deployment, however, was deeper. Alexander anticipated that the Persians would try to outflank him, so he angled his outer guards inward and placed a second reserve line of infantry behind the main front, ready to turn and face any force that broke around the rear. The Macedonian army was not just a line. It was a hedged, spiked structure designed to avoid being swallowed whole. Darius deployed to consume space. Alexander deployed to survive distortion. That difference would decide everything. Opening phase. The drift to the right when the battle began. Many expected a frontal collision. Alexander gave them something stranger. He ordered his army to move diagonally to the right. This was not hesitation. It was spatial violence disguised as motion. By drifting sideways, Alexander was dragging the battle off the carefully prepared ground Darius had leveled for chariots and cavalry. He was forcing the Persian line to extend, react, and deform. To avoid being outflanked, Bessus had to stretch his cavalry farther and farther to match the movement. This was exactly the reaction Alexander wanted. The larger the Persian line became, the harder it would be to keep perfectly coherent. Cavalry fighting and the collapse of the chariots at the same time, Darius committed his terrifying front-rank weapon, the scythed chariots. They charged. But the Macedonian response was one of the most disciplined battlefield reactions in ancient warfare. Instead of panicking, the phalanx opened lanes, letting the chariots pass through gaps. Once they were isolated, lighter troops and rear forces pulled down drivers and neutralized the vehicles. The great shock weapon of the Persian king failed under Macedonian control and preparation. Meanwhile, the cavalry struggle on Alexander's right became savage. Persian numbers pressed hard. The air, dust, and noise must have been overwhelming. But the more cavalry Persia committed into the fight there, the more the line bent. The more it bent, the greater the danger near the center left where Darius stood. The decisive blow, then came the moment. As the Persian line stretched and deformed, a gap appeared in the left center. Alexander saw it instantly. He gathered the Companion Cavalry and elite supporting troops into a wedge and drove directly into the opening with all the force and speed he could generate. This is the most famous moment in the battle, but it only became possible because of everything before it. The rightward drift, the forced extension of the Persian line, the failed chariot assault, and the distortion of the engagement zone. This was not a reckless, heroic rush. It was a carefully manufactured incision. The flight of Darius as Alexander's elite spearhead punched toward the Persian center and toward the king himself. Darius broke. He turned and fled. Once again, as at Issus, the psychological center of Persian resistance collapsed with the man at its heart. Whatever tactical possibilities remained elsewhere on the field, the symbolic spine of the army had just snapped. The King of Kings had abandoned the fight, and the center began to give way. Crisis on the left, and yet, even at the threshold of total triumph, the battle was not done. Alexander was ready to pursue Darius when an urgent message arrived. Parmenion on the left was in serious danger under the pressure of Isaias. Persian and Indian cavalry had even pushed through gaps and were striking the Macedonian camp. If Alexander chased Darius too far, he risked winning the center while losing cohesion elsewhere. So he made the harder choice. He broke off the pursuit and turned back to rescue his army. That decision cost him dearly. More than 60 of his elite Companion Cavalry fell in the brutal fighting required to stabilize the situation, but it also completed the victory properly. This was not the choice of a man intoxicated by personal glory. It was the choice of a commander who understood that the army mattered more than the image of the chase. When the dust cleared over Gaugamela, the Persian army had been broken, its center shattered, and its emperor driven from the field. Parmenion secured the Persian camp. The Macedonians, bloody but victorious, had survived the largest battlefield challenge of Alexander's career and turned it into a strategic breakthrough. The price was heavy, especially among the elite cavalry, but the outcome was decisive. The dust finally cleared over the plains of Gaugamela. The fury of the Macedonian army subsided. General Parmenion rode to secure the Persian camp, while Alexander's warriors finally earned a well-deserved rest. But the price of this monumental victory wasn't cheap. Over 60 elite Companion Cavalry had fallen in the desperate, bloody effort to save the left wing. In the distance, King Darius III had managed to slip the net to Arbela, continuing his flight deep into the east. Though the biggest prize escaped, Alexander had no reason to be overly bitter. The death sentence for the Persian Empire had officially been signed. The second massive army, the last true hope of the Achaemenid dynasty, had been completely annihilated. The supreme authority of Darius collapsed. From the King of Kings, he was now exposed to the world as a coward unable to defend his own realm. Looking at the big picture, Gaugamela is a flawless, sharp, and magnificent lesson in the art of spatial manipulation in warfare. This battle is often celebrated for a king's heroic charge, but the deeper truth is, Alexander won by manipulating space. He coldly refused to march into the trap his enemy had painstakingly cleared, bent the original logic of the engagement, dragged it sideways, and turned the massive scale of the Persian Empire into its own fatal vulnerability. He didn't use brute force to overpower an entire front. He made a single decisive section fail at the absolute worst possible time. With the devastating victory at Gaugamela, the spine of the Persian Empire was broken. The door to the vast east swung wide open. Alexander the Great was now free to step over the corpse of the old dynasty, march into the great expanse of the Persian Empire, claim unimaginably vast treasures, and continue his eternal journey to the very edge of the world,